We've made it to the All-Star break, and fans are already nervously flipping through the final months of the Sacramento Kings schedule, seeing all the matchups against teams also in the Western Conference playoff race, and they're getting a little nervous. Well, on today's Locked On Kings podcast, I'm going to be joined by Kings reporter for the Sacramento Bee, Chris Biederman. He and I will discuss the race and the expectations for the Kings being a playoff team versus falling into the play-in. It's all right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season long. Today, presented by Prize Picks. You can receive a 100% instant deposit match if you're a first-time user, up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports reporter and producer for ABC 10 News, and I've been going back and forth with a lot of Kings fans that have kind of welcomed the pessimistic viewpoint back into their season. It really seems like the trade deadline has awakened a lot of those fears or negative feelings that Kings fans tend to have about their team. And I understand 16 years will do that to people. So instead of diving deeper into that, and whether you feel on the optimistic side with me or on the pessimistic side, regardless, of course, if we all want the same thing. And the reality of the situation is, no matter if you feel like the Kings are going to handle their business or not, it's going to be tough sledding for the Kings going forward. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I could not sleep. So I put together a basically the teams that are in that 3 to 6 mix in the West, right? Because making the playoffs is securing a top 6 seed. If you fall to 7, 8, 9, or 10, you are in the play-in. And we would like the Kings to avoid the play-in altogether, of course. And many, myself included, would be disappointed at this point in time with the Kings being 7 games over 500 and in the 3rd seed in the West. I know the race is close, but I would be very disappointed with the Kings falling into the play-in picture when everything is all said and done. They're going to have to handle their business. So I took all the teams that are in the 3 to 6 mix, which are the Kings, Suns, Clippers, Mavs, Pelicans, T-Wolves, and Warriors. I've intentionally left the Nuggets and Grizzlies out of it. The Nuggets, I think, are in the clear. The Grizzlies could definitely fall into that 3 to 6 mix, but they're ahead, so I'm leaving them out of it. I'm also leaving the Timberwolves, Lakers, and the Jazz out of it because they're under 500 teams, even though they're still very much in the mix themselves. So the teams in the 3 to 6 mix are the Kings, Suns, Clippers, Mavs, Pelicans, T-Wolves, and Warriors. And basically, I looked at all the games that those teams have against each other. The Kings play other teams in the 3 to 6 mix 10 times. The Suns, 7 times. The Clippers, 9 times. The Mavs, 4 times. The Pelicans, 8 times. The T-Wolves, 7 times. And the Warriors, 10 times. That's important for 2 reasons. Number 1, these teams are going to be playing with each other in addition to trying to catch the Kings. So when one of these teams beats another, the Kings both lose ground and gain ground, at least on nights where the Kings aren't playing. But I actually like the fact, some are nervous about the fact that the Kings still have 10 games remaining against these other teams that are gunning for them. I think that's a positive because that means the Kings are in control of their destiny. If they beat the Suns, if they beat the Clippers, if they beat the Mavs, they get a game over them. If they lose, then things shrink by a game. They don't have to worry about other teams doing their work for them. They can try and handle their business themselves. Again, being in control of your destiny is what you want. The Kings are very much in control of their destiny for the remainder of the season. Now, I mentioned that the Grizzlies and Nuggets are not in the mix. They're the top 2. And the Kings only play the Nuggets 1 time, and that's it. They're done playing the Grizzlies. They play the Nuggets 1 more time throughout the course of the season. That's it. While the Suns play the Grizzlies or the Nuggets 2 times, the Clippers 4 times, the Mavs 4 times, the Pelicans 2 times, the Timberwolves no times. They're done playing those 2 teams, and the Warriors 3 times. So even if the Kings are playing the other in the mix teams more than every team except for the Warriors, almost every other team except for the Timberwolves has to play the top 2 teams in the West more than the Kings do, and that has an impact. And then finally, games remaining against teams that are under 500. The Kings have 9 games against other 500 teams. The Suns have 11 games. I expect the Suns to leapfrog the Kings. Not to mention the Suns and the Kings play 2 more times. The Clippers have 8 games. The Mavs have 11 games. The Pelicans have 11 games. The T-Wolves have 8 games. And the Warriors have 9 games. So, again, the current standings for the 3 through 9 seeds, the Suns are 1 game back of the Kings. Clippers a game and a half back. Mavs 2 games back. Pelicans 2.5. T-Wolves 2.5. Warriors 3.5. Those are seeds 3 through 9 at this point in time. So, my point is take all of that information, take into account these teams have to play each other as well as try and catch the Kings. The Kings are in control of their own destiny. There are a good amount of games left against under 500 teams. The Kings don't have to play the best in the West as many times as the rest of those teams other than the Timberwolves do. Take that into account and tell me if you would feel confident putting money on 4 teams in that mix, leapfrogging the Kings and pushing them into the play-in picture. I don't think there are 4 teams better than the Kings in the West to knock them out of that spot, excluding, of course, the Nuggets and the Memphis Grizzlies. So find me those 4 teams if you want, or if you feel the same way I do, that there aren't 4 teams and the Kings will secure a top 6 seed, then I'm in agreement with you. I feel pretty confident about that. But enough about me. Let's get Chris Biederman in there. A good conversation with Chris. He's a very level-headed journalist when it comes to covering the Sacramento Kings. Doesn't get nearly as emotional as I do when covering the Kings. Has been on the Kings beat now for a couple of seasons. Does an excellent job over with the Sacramento Bee. He was just in Phoenix covering the Kings and Suns last night. So very excited to have back here on Locked On Kings, Chris Biederman. You might know him from all of his time covering the San Francisco 49ers, but I'm pleased that Chris Biederman from the Sacramento Bee is strongly on the Kings beat this season. And we've had a lot of fun covering this Sacramento Kings rise into the 3rd seed, a team 7 games over 500 at the All-Star break. And still, Chris, there is concern that it is all going to be for naught and it will all fall apart. We'll touch on that. We'll get your thoughts just on this first quote unquote half of the season, expectations for All-Star break and everything. But it's a pleasure, Chris, to have you back on Locked On Kings, my friend. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I'm hoping you don't put me on skates. Too badly. Chris, hopefully I can find my footing a little bit.
Chris will never ever let me live that down. We're going to be in our 50s one day, just reuniting for some media event, and Chris is going to bring that comment up. And you know what? That's fine. I stand by the skates comment. De'Aaron Fox and I are best friends. Anyway, you would think he would like me based off of how much I've been appreciative of him and his play so far. And of course, De'Aaron being an all-star, he's finally getting the representation that he deserves. I don't think it needed to be an injury reserve for him to get there. He deserved to get there nonetheless, but regardless, he's there. But Chris, recently, especially on Saturday, the win against the Dallas Mavericks, we saw, okay, this is star Fox. And we've seen pieces of it throughout this season, but that was De'Aaron Fox being the best player on the floor while sharing the court with both Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic and leading the Kings to what I thought was a win to put a lot of stock in. What did you take away from that game and that Fox performance?
Yeah, I wrote about it a little bit. It was just, it felt like a playoff game, right? Like we've gotten to the point now where I think we've accepted the Kings as a playoff team. But now it's like, all right, how are they going to adjust to different situations and different atmospheres and different levels of intensity? And I think that's what we saw against Dallas and to a certain extent against Phoenix on Tuesday, albeit they lost that game. But I think they're at the point now where it's like, okay, they're beyond. Are they a playoff team? Like they're beyond that conversation. They are to the point now where, hey, we're good enough but can we win a playoff series? Right? Can we make defensive adjustments? Can we have clutch scoring? It's beyond like roster construction and all that type of stuff. To me, I think it's about, how far can they go as constructed? How much chemistry can they build? How much of a learning experience can this playoff run be? Because like, let's be honest, like this Kings team more than likely is not winning a title, right? Like I think going to the Western Conference Finals is probably about as far as they can get. Now I would venture to guess that that's still a massive reach, right? Like if they win a playoff series, I would consider this season a massive success based on what our expectations were of this team coming into the year and how the season has gone. They win 2 playoff series. They're in the Western Conference Finals. Obviously, just that's a huge deal considering this team has spent, the last 16 seasons, toiling in mediocrity to flat out misery, right? So I think when you look back on Saturday against Dallas, that was a playoff level atmosphere, a playoff like moment. And there was sort of the added dynamic of it being a back to back, sort of like a mini series,
Mm.
and Mike Brown making adjustments and Jason Kidd making adjustments. And, the just overall the team making the adjustment of, okay, we can't ease into this game in the first quarter like they did the previous night and that Friday when Dallas came in and scored 45 points on them in the first quarter. Like that was sort of a mental adjustment, right? So just the tinkering, the adjustments, the intensity, all that stuff sort of lent itself to a playoff style of basketball. And obviously that's going to look way different when we get to, April, of course. But that's the thing that I'm looking for from this team, I think, over the remaining 25 games on the schedule after the All-Star break is like, how do they hold up in those moments? And those will go a long way towards helping us figure out how good this team actually is.
See, you and I are on the same page in a lot of ways. My expectation, if I'm being brutally honest with you, and some might call it a pessimistic expectation, I expect the Sacramento Kings to maybe not make it out of the first round. Now, I'm hoping this team proves me wrong, but they haven't been there before. And getting there was my ultimate goal for the season. If they win a playoff series, you're damn right I'm throwing a parade for that. But there's a contingency of Kings fans, a pretty sizable contingency that are not there yet, that would say that we're jumping the gun calling this team a playoff team, despite what they've shown through nearly 60 games so far this season. They think that there's a very, very good chance, and of course, mathematically there is, that the Kings don't just fall out of the top four, but fall completely out of the six into the play-in picture, which I think we all would agree that would be disappointing for this team at this point. I push back strongly against that based off of the context from this season, what this team has shown, and I understand the frustrations of the Kings kind of staying put at the trade deadline while other teams got better. But in reality, I believe that this team, as constructed, was going to take you as far as you were going to go regardless. So I'm curious how you feel about the possibility, or some would say probability, I say small likelihood, of the Kings falling completely out of the top six.
I think that would probably require an injury, right? Like it would probably, you lose Domantas Sabonis and or De'Aaron Fox for a substantial amount of time. I just think, look, they're seventh in the NBA in net rating and third in the Western Conference in net rating. And that's despite not having a particularly good defense. Although I do think the defensive numbers, and we went through this the other night, they're a little noisier than I think, like, just, say they're 23rd. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like what was 23rd in 1 month is like top 10 in another month. You know what I mean? In terms of like that 115 to 113 number in terms of defensive efficiency. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that the Kings are a good defensive team, because I don't think they are. But I think 23rd is a little bit, I just think those numbers are noisy, because that 115 number can be 23rd 1 month and then, top 12 in another month. And anyway, beyond that, like they're the top three in net rating in the Western Conference. They can score, which we've seen over and over again be, at least in the regular season when it comes to seeding, be an indicator of where teams go as far as, being a playoff team in the regular season. I just think they're too good. Like they're relatively, I don't want to say they're a complete roster, but like when they added Kevin Huerter in the trade deadline, in the offseason, that felt to me like a trade deadline type move. Like, okay, you got that shooting guard, because they didn't have a starting caliber shooting guard last season, really at any point. And, Justin Holiday and Lamb, like those guys just weren't it, right? And obviously they're not even around anymore. But I think it would have to take an injury, because, look, they have two All-Stars. I think, just about every other team that has two All-Stars is a playoff team that we think of. I think Mike Brown is a playoff caliber coach. He's been there. He knows what it takes, and what being successful looks like. Like, we don't have to go through the fact that he's coached with the San Antonio Spurs and the Kobe Bryant Lakers and LeBron James Cavs and the Steph Curry Warriors. Like, he knows exactly what this process entails. And so I think you have an inherent level, you should have an inherent level of trust with the coaching staff, because this isn't like a first time head coach. Like it's a first year of the Mike Brown regime, but it's not a guy who's never been a head coach before or never seen anything. Like one of the main reasons why Monty McNair wanted Mike Brown so much was just his track record with all of the winning environments he's been in. So I think that's a significant part of it. But no, it is a certain level. Like we are projecting a little bit here, right? Like we don't know for sure, because obviously the Suns are going to be really good. Like when they get Kevin Durant, they're probably going to leapfrog the Kings, and then you're looking at somewhere between the 4 and 7, 8 seed with the Kings, and then I just think, like, I don't have any reason to believe that there's going to be some massive drop off. I think once they tighten up the rotations, and maybe if the rotation gets a little bit smaller, and maybe if they make some tinkering, some adjustments to their rotations, I think the Kings are ultimately going to be better. And I have some ideas on that, but which we can talk about. But I just think that as we go, the Kings are probably more likely to get better than get worse, as long as they keep their core guys healthy.
Like I said at the top of the show, today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the #1 way to play daily fantasy sports. Here's the way it works. You pick 2 to 6 players, and if they will go score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. And it's not just the prime time main name players like De'Aaron Fox or Domantas Sabonis. You can pick how much, if Malik Monk is going to score more or less than his projection. Keegan Murray, even Trey Lyles. Like, they have it for everybody, for every single team. And it's not just basketball. Of course, they have the NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, college football, men's college basketball, women's college basketball, soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, disc golf, Euro basketball, cricket, and more. All the sports you can think of, Prize Picks offers and gives you a chance to make your money. Entry can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. They offer safe and fast withdrawals and are currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. It's just you versus the Prize Picks projections. You're not competing against anybody else. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. Now, first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKED ON. So you deposit $100, you get $100 free. You deposit $50, you get $50 free right away. So that's free money that you can then make money on Prize Picks, the #1 place to play daily fantasy sports. This just dawned on me, like, believe it or not, calling Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox all-stars might also be kind of undervaluing them compared to the other acquisitions and big names in the Western Conference. And what I mean by that is, like, Domantas Sabonis is doing what only Nikola Jokic is doing as a big man in the NBA this year. Like, he's putting up numbers that only Nikola Jokic, the 2-time MVP, maybe 3 straight time MVP, is capable of putting up. He's 3rd in the league in triple doubles behind Jokic and behind Luka Doncic. And on top of that, of course, we know how important he is to the Sacramento Kings. Then you have De'Aaron Fox, who's the most clutch player in the league and has gone toe-to-toe nightly with the best in the NBA and oftentimes outperformed them. Like, he was on the same level as Devin Booker last night in Phoenix. It just so happened that the Kings lost, but De'Aaron scored over 30 points again, nearly dragged the Kings to a victory that some would say they had no business kind of being in. And then, of course, how they outperformed both Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, two many would consider first ballot Hall of Famers. De'Aaron Fox outperformed them and led the Kings to a win in that sense. So I think Sacramento Kings fans, because we're used to Fox and we're used to Sabonis, and we hear names like KD and Luka and Kyrie and all these other names in the West that we only get to see once or twice a year and we see in highlight reels on ESPN all the time. I think we say that they're not on the same tier. But my point is, I think the Kings star 2 is up there with some of the best in the NBA. Now, are they on the same tier as Kevin Durant? Absolutely not. Are they on the same tier as Nikola Jokic? Absolutely not. He's an MVP. But I think we even have fans, believe it or not, underselling what those two mean to the success of the Sacramento Kings going forward and how good those two are and the impact that they will have directly on Kings winning. Because the reality is, even if the schedule is difficult from here on out for the remainder of the season, this is what you want. Like, you want these games to be important. The Kings have 10 games against other in the mix teams in the Western Conference. You have control of your destiny. Some people would prefer to have less games. I say more. Because if you win those games, you create the separation you need. You don't rely on other teams to handle your business for you. This is where Domantas Sabonis, De'Aaron Fox, and that core group that you surrounded themselves with, like Kevin, like Malik, like Keegan, like Harrison, that's where this team, I think, really separates itself. And I think fans forgot that, or at least brushed under the rug a little bit because the Kings didn't add bench depth at the trade deadline.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, but I think the broader point here too is about experience, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Durant has a track record in the playoffs. Kyrie
Right.
Irving has a track record in the playoffs. Luka
Right.
Doncic has a track record in the playoffs. Nikola Jokic, like we can go down the line. Like the
Absolutely.
reason why I think fans correctly differentiate this Kings team from some of those teams, and particular in the Stars, it's a different brand of basketball when you get to the postseason.
Absolutely.
And that's not to say I don't think the Kings can play that style, but it's just a test that they haven't seen yet. And look, like you go back to 2013 with the Warriors, and I made this point elsewhere, like that team was upstart, like really good, high ceiling, but really the reason why they didn't last beyond the second round against San Antonio, or even a year later when they went 7 games with the Clippers and lost in the first round, it was about experience.
Right.
Like that's the whole point of this season for this team. It's not necessarily how far can you go this year. Obviously, you're trying to win. But to me, it's like, can they build a foundation that they can pull from going forward? Whereas, in 2024, are they a legitimate, championship type team? Do they have the requisite experience, the player development, and can they add a piece or two that elevates them to that next level beyond where they're at this year? Like this year to me is about getting that experience, getting those playoff reps to where you know what you need to contend year in and year out, which is how the Warriors benefited from those playoff runs in 2013 and 2014 before ultimately winning the title in 2015, right? And I have no idea if the Kings are ever going to get to that level where we're talking about them as legitimate title contenders, but you don't just get there in 1 year, right? And so the big difference, I think, between De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, and Sabonis has played in the playoffs in the East a little bit, but it's about those playoff reps and being able to make those adjustments when the game slows down. The Kings aren't going to be able to play at their same pace in the playoffs, and they're going to, their rotation is going to be 7 or 8 guys. They're not going to be going way down the depths of of the bench to try to find guys. That's ultimately kind of been the thing that I find funny about all the discussion, like, oh, they need to add guys and shore up the bench. It's like, sure, you could say that, but when they get to the playoffs, like they're not getting past Trey Lyles. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a very decent chance that Trey Lyles is the deepest you go on the bench, and he's playing both backup 4 and backup 5, because we've seen Mike Brown go to Trey Lyles in overtime twice now within the last couple of weeks when Domantas Sabonis is fouled out. I find that very telling that he's not going to Chimezie Metu in those situations. He's going to Trey Lyles. And I find it, frankly, I think it's been really effective. And I would guess in the playoffs, if the playoffs were to start tomorrow, that Trey Lyles would be the guy getting those backup minutes at 5. But anyway, the point here is that, like, the Kings, for them to truly be considered in that same tier as some of those other teams with those superstars that you've mentioned, it's about getting playoff reps. And once they get those playoff reps and figure out, okay, this is what it takes to win in the postseason, then we can group them in with those other teams and stars more comfortably. Whereas right now it's just kind of a giant question mark. But that's what makes this season fun, is like it's a question mark, and can they figure it out? And can it ultimately lead to more success down the road? Because I think even the most optimistic Kings fan this year has to be realistic and understand, like, no, this team's not going to win the title or even get to the finals, but can they win a playoff round or two? And can they pull from that experience down the road and actually take that next step towards title contention? Because ultimately that's the goal.
Chris, you're absolutely right with the playoffs being a different beast. And that's where I think it's going to be the biggest wake-up call for the Kings. But isn't there a lot of value to the experience of this playoff race, with the Kings being thickly in the mix with teams in the West that are not only experienced playoff teams, but they're in the mix with a group of 2 or 3 teams that are essentially in that win a championship or make the Western Conference Finals, or it's a disappointment season. Like the Kings, some would say, are in a position that they don't really belong in when it comes to the tiers and expectations of those around them.
Yeah, no, totally. Like they absolutely are in the mix, I think, with, the Kings on their best night can hang with Denver and Dallas. And, I guess this version of the Warriors potentially. I don't know, Phoenix, once they add Kevin Durant, that's a whole different animal.
Right.
But I mean, the fear, and Kings fans aren't going to want to hear this, but the fear is like they're that Atlanta Hawks team, right? That was like perpetually good in the regular season,
Mhm.
had some star players, but ultimately wasn't worth a damn in the playoffs. And I think De'Aaron Fox's game, particularly with how he plays in fourth quarters, is built for the playoffs. And you could say the same thing for Domantas Sabonis. And the fact that, the other thing with like not adding bench depth, one of the reasons why the Kings offense is so good is because they always have four shooters on the floor, like
Mhm.
always. And the offense takes a big hit when Davion Mitchell isn't hitting shots, or when, when Malik Monk's struggling to hit shots. Like that's really the Kings' bigger issue. And I never thought that adding, say Matisse Thybulle, a guy who's not going to make shots, was going to make a tangible difference for this team, because the reason why first of all, they're good offensively. Like that's the defining characteristic of this team. You take away their offense, and then all of a sudden they pull a lot closer towards mediocrity. And then, the defense, I don't think is going to make, like, you need to be able to play both sides of the floor. Like that's ultimately the most valuable thing in the NBA. And so giving up assets to guys that pull away from your strength offensively to maybe be a little bit better marginally defensively, I just, that fully never made sense to me, because I really think murdering the offense by having a non-shooter on the floor would be far more detrimental than, what you're giving up defensively right now by not having an elite defender, outside of maybe Davion Mitchell. So anyway, I think it's a convoluted point, but like the Kings are better than Minnesota. I think
Mhm.
the Clippers, I mean, the theoretical version of the Clippers is better than the Kings, but we haven't seen the Clippers play for any extended period together, and we don't know that they're going to be healthy. But they did make reinforcements. That's a team you got to be leery of. But like, Phoenix, obviously we talked about them. I think the Kings are squarely in the mix here, and they have, they still have to play Boston. They have to go to Portland for 2 games, which could be interesting down the road. They have 2 in Oklahoma City after playing at the Clippers coming out of the All-Star break. They have another pretty long homestand. I'm looking at the schedule right now. They got to go to Chicago, Brooklyn, Washington, and Utah in
Mhm.
March. Like they're gonna be tests for them that are gonna be a hell of a lot more valuable than that 7-game trip that they just had through Minnesota and San Antonio and Indianapolis and Houston. So like they're gonna learn that they're gonna be tested definitely down the stretch, and how they respond could go toward, a long way towards defining where they sit in the playoffs and ultimately what happens once they do get there.
Chris, the 3-point shooting over the last handful of weeks has been, I know, concerning to a lot of fans. And a lot of us, I think, are putting our faith into the All-Star break and refreshing the shooters as the fix that's going to get them back to where they were shooting earlier on in the season, basically putting it on tired legs. Is that wishful thinking, or do you really think this team is having that significant of a drop off shooting wise just because of the fatigue of this season?
Yeah, I think I talked to Kevin Herter about this a little bit, when we spoke last night about the 3-point contest. And he had 4 threes against the Suns, which was his most in a game in a month, after it seemed like he was good for 4 or 5 threes a game during the first 6 weeks of the season. And he just talked about kind of just being out of rhythm. Like it wasn't even necessarily a fatigue thing. It was, there was a 7-game road trip. It was just out of rhythm, and I think teams are defending Domantas Sabonis and the dribble handoffs a little bit differently. They're probably hedging a little bit more. They're probably going over more screens than they had been. But I mean, Keegan Murray's shooting 42%. You still got 39% from Herter. Harrison Barnes is at a very respectable 37%. Trey Lyles is 36% off the bench, as is Terrence Davis. So I think they're still in a pretty good spot. I think ultimately, you would like De'Aaron Fox to maybe be a little bit better from three. He's only at 33% right now. That's rounding up. He's 32.5%. But like, yeah, I think the 3-point shooting is going to be more about rhythm. And I think the one thing that you get in the playoffs is you have a better chance to be in a rhythm because generally you're playing every other day. You're not traveling. When you are traveling, you're in a city for a few days at a time. You have an opportunity to get a little bit more comfortable and have that cadence about you. Whereas, the Kings just came off a stretch where they played 5 games in 7 days, which included the back end of their longest road trip of the season. So I think the 3-point shooting, I'm not super concerned about it because we know they have guys who do shoot well. And we haven't really seen that super hot streak from Malik Monk, which he's probably capable of, right? He's been iffy from 3-point range for most of the season where, he was pretty good from 3 last year, which is what made him so appealing to the Kings in the offseason. But I tend to think, given that, they always have 4 shooters on the floor with a center who distributes, that the shooting's going to come around. I think it's, I don't love talking about fatigue because every NBA team deals with this stuff. Like every NBA team has a tough schedule. They all play a lot of games. They all travel a lot. So I think everyone is kind of on a level playing field when it comes to fatigue. But I do think it's real. But I think it's the more tangible part of it is just being in rhythm and just being able to, know you're going to play every other day instead of have a handful of back-to-backs and travel to multiple cities and things like that. So I think as we get closer to the playoffs and even in the playoffs, the 3-point shooting is probably going to be better than it has been recently.
Another quick pause here as I tell you about a great longtime sponsor of the Locked On Kings podcast. That is Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all that fat and all the calories that come with those snacks and those things that satisfy your sweet tooth, you have to try Built Bars. Now that we're through the holidays, I know my goal is to eat a little bit healthier. For me, it's add some protein to my diet, right? If you've seen me in person, I'm a skinny guy. I could use the protein, but I like junk food. I like sweet tooth stuff, right? Well, Built Bars are perfect for me because they have the protein that I need and they're delicious, covered in 100% chocolate, all these great flavor profiles. My favorite is the mint brownie bar. They also have amazing granola bars to give me fuel if I'm just out and about. And if I'm really into some sweet stuff and want a dessert, they have their marshmallow puffs, their protein-infused puffs. They all satisfy those sweet tooth taste buds and those snacking urges that I have and cravings that I have, but they are good for me and help me accomplish my goals. Only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and here's what's big for me, a whopping 17 grams of protein in every average Built Bar. And they come in flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. There's so many out there for you to try. And now you don't just have to go to built.com to get yourself a box of Built Bars or any of their Built products. You can go to Walmart, you can go to Sam's Club, go to the pharmacy section. You can get a box there. Give it a try. Run into the Sam's Club and get their 13-bar box with all of the hit flavors and tell me which ones are your favorite. Give them a try. You won't be disappointed. BuiltBar.com. Finally, Chris, I agree with you what you said earlier that you think the leading factor to the Kings falling apart and falling out of the playoff picture and into the play-in picture is health. What about this team specifically, whether it's you can point to a moment, you can point to a player, you can point to a trait of this team, what about this team specifically gives you the most confidence in their ability to secure a playoff spot, a top 6 spot?
This is going to sound corny, but I think it's just culture. Like, I really think, I was skeptical. I've only been covering this team for 2 years now. I was skeptical about De'Aaron Fox and sort of, what kind of player he was, what type of leader he was. And I don't know that he's like one of the best leaders in the league, but I have been convinced this season, being around the team more and more, that he's bought into the idea of like, no, I just want to be in Sacramento. I want to be a one city guy. He's not just a guy who's going to put up numbers on a bad team. He legitimately wants to win. He's bought into defense in a way that he never really has before. And I think a lot of that is a credit to Mike Brown. I think they're invested in winning, and Mike Brown knows what it takes to win. He knows what it takes to develop a culture that forces players to have good habits, or, you're not going to be here. Like, if you're not professional, if you're not about doing what it takes to win and putting in the work, like that's just not going to be tolerated. And from afar, it didn't seem like that was always the case with Kings, right? Like you don't have 16 seasons without making the playoffs by accident. Like
Right.
there were a lot of issues from what I've heard and observed that plagued this franchise for a while. But I think ultimately they have a culture. There's a level of accountability, and when they win, they have fun. Like it's a team that enjoys being around each other. Malik Monk, whether or not he's being super productive for them on the court, he's really kind of a force in the locker room that brings guys together, right? Like Harrison Barnes, you can make a case that 15 points a game and 47% shooting and 5 rebounds, whatever. Like he's not a super valuable player. Well, to this team, he is, because he's really the only guy with championship or playoff level experience. And he's just sort of, he's another one of those. He's a very different personality from Malik, but he's also a guy that brings personalities in the locker room together. And I think Domantas Sabonis is very much, the type of guy. Like Domantas Sabonis will never take a night off if he doesn't have to. Like he's very much out on the load management type stuff. You talk to him about it, he's like, no, I'm paid to play. I'm paid to play every night, and I'm never going to take a night off. And that matters. Like the fact that he has an avulsion fracture in his thumb and is just playing through it, like that stuff matters and sets the tone. And I think, you can even make a similar case about Keegan Murray. Like talk about, Keegan Murray versus anybody else in the draft. And I know, there was all the talk about Ivy and Detroit and the guy who went 5th. Keegan Murray is as much of a culture fit as anything else, right? Like the fact that his personality is what it is and perfectly blends into the locker room in terms of that work ethic and accountability. And I'm not saying Jaden Ivey doesn't have that, but I think when it comes to fit with the organization, like setting that culture was as big as anything else. And so to me, when you look at the way this team's constructed and just being around them and how much they enjoy being around each other, and like, the defensive player of the game chain and the smoke machines and the lasers, like all that stuff is real. Like it's not just like fake social media stuff. All that stuff is real. Terrence Davis, another guy, like great personality, a guy everybody in that locker room loves, right? That stuff just matters. There aren't any bad apples on the team. And so that to me is what's most sustainable about this. Like I've been in, covering the 49ers, like the biggest issue that they had for all those years when things were bad, it wasn't about talent, because the most talented team that I covered was the 2014 49ers, which was coming off 3 straight trips to the NFC Championship game. The most talented roster they had was 2014, and that team went 8-8 because the culture was terrible. There was all this stuff with Trent Baalke and Jim Harbaugh and all that stuff. Culture really matters. It can be a unifying force that allows, the sum to be greater than its parts, right? Like I think that's the right expression. I'm using that correctly. But no, so I think when it comes to this Kings team and what's sustainable about it, yeah, you can point to the offense. You can point to the coaching staff, sure. But I think ultimately there's a different culture now when it comes to the locker room, and that everybody is very unified in what they're doing, and they want to do it for the fans, and they're really enjoying the light the beam stuff. And so I think that's ultimately what matters most, and what is most sustainable when it comes to year over year being a winning organization.
Well, the final months of this season, the final games of this season are certainly going to be stressful. Of course, Chris Biederman will be all over the coverage of the Sacramento Kings from the Golden One Center and beyond over at the Sacramento Bee. And then, of course, 49ers fans, if you're not aware already, which I don't know how you wouldn't be, check out Chris's work with the Candlestick Chronicles and Kyle Madsen and that podcast over there. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you with me. So appreciate your time, my friend. Looking forward to riding this wave with you for the rest of the season. Hopefully we're covering playoff basketball. I expect we'll be covering playoff basketball here in just a few months.
Yeah, I would too. And I hope you enjoy your break, man. Hope you get to have some fun in Salt Lake City. Stay warm over there. I'd love to say I'm upset I'm not going, but I'm gonna maybe play some golf and take my mind off the Kings for a little bit during the break. So
I can appreciate that, and I think a lot of players are going to be doing the same thing. Thank you, Chris, so much. Talk to you soon.
No problem. Thanks for having me, man.
Really a pleasure having Chris join me. I appreciate what he brings to the table. He and I are kind of on the same wavelength with our optimism or positive expectations for the Kings and how they will handle their business. I know many of you might be feeling otherwise. Maybe the two of us or Chris specifically helped convince you or maybe make you a little bit more confident. Whatever it is, let's talk about it. At Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. I am heading to All-Star Weekend. I leave tomorrow, so there will not be a Thursday Locked On Kings podcast. I am flying to All-Star, and then my plan is Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night to have 3 new podcasts for you talking about what I'm experiencing in All-Star, covering Keegan Murray in the Rising Stars Challenge, Kevin Huerter in the 3-point contest on Saturday night, and then Fox and Sabonis in the All-Star game itself on Sunday. So very much looking forward to that. Hope you will join me for that content. Appreciate your support as always, whether we agree or disagree. I love you so much. I love the conversations that we have, and I'm very thankful that we can all connect through our love of the game of basketball and our love of the Sacramento Kings. So thank you so much. Can't wait to have you join me on one of these All-Star editions of the Locked On Kings podcast. Until then, my name is Matt George. You've been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.